Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to RaC Girl Town Hall number 20. We're a little bit late getting going, but we've got 17 people today, which is wonderful. It's really good. Jason, you are a superstar who is attracting all of these people. And we're really looking forward to hearing the, a little bit more about Rules as Code Europe 2026. And you made a number of presentations there. We can have questions for Jason at the end of the session. Well, in about 30 minutes, I think. It depends how long Jason's presentation is. I won't say any more. Take it away, Jason.
Great. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share in the chat a link to a video that I just found today that is kind of a recap video that was done of the conference, this is the kind of conference where they have videographers and photographers walking around the entire time, and then they release a recap video 2 days after the conference is finished. So an impressive level of organization. And yes, I am sufficiently self-obsessed that I did look through the video to see if I'm in it. And there I am. So this is my documentation that I actually was at the conference for everyone. And now let's see. So you can fast forward to 1 minute 29 if you want to see me. This was the section of the conference where they actually had the 5 production rules as code systems, and they talked about all 5 of them in the same session. So I was very happy to be there. Now let me see if I can switch to the slides, which I will apologize in advance, are not fancy, but they do cover the bases. Let's see, where's the slideshow button? There, is that working?
That's perfect, Jason. Thank you.
Okay. So this is, I was just an attendee, but this is kind of what I was able to absorb about the Rules as Code Europe 2026 conference. This was held in The Hague in the Netherlands, and it was on March 10th and 11th, so not really that long ago. I'm happy to be able to bring you it while it's fresh in my mind. The first thing to know is who set it up. This was sponsored by the Dutch Ministry of the Interior, the Dutch Ministry of Justice, something called ICTU, which is an internal Dutch organization that helps different levels of government do digitalization projects together. An organization called GovTech for All, which is a government technology incubator inside the EU, which has an interest in rules as code. And then also the EU Directorate General for Digital Services, which I guess is abbreviated DG Digit. And that is a pan-European digital interoperability organization inside the EU government structure. And so it is motivated to make sure that the different EU governments are using systems that at a fundamental level are capable of communicating with one another where they need to collaborate. So those were the people setting it up. This was the 2nd edition of this conference, the first one having been held in Paris last year. It was 2 days, 3 tracks. The 3 tracks are governance and policy, rules as code community, and engineering rules as code. By far the largest part of it was rules as code community. If you had to describe it in 5 words, this was like an EU government show and tell. Almost half of the presentations were case studies. More than half of the presentations were for people working in government, and the vast majority of those were working in the Dutch government. More than half of the tools that were demonstrated were internal government tools. There were only 5 production systems that were being talked about or demonstrated. So most of the rest of the talks were about pilots and experiments. There was around 300 people attending, about 95% of which were coming from EU nations. And there was a session, in the first session, they had people raise their hands, depending on if they were technologists or policy experts or legal. I'm gauging it was around 40, 40, 20. for the breakdown between those categories. So it really was a kind of an interdisciplinary, very EU focused and very government focused group. So these are the themes that were being discussed over the course of the 2 days. And it's not that there were sessions on these things, but these were topics that kept coming up over and over again over the course of 2 days. The first one is semantic interoperability. So there's a law in Europe called the Interoperable Europe Act, which is administered by DG Digit. And that requires the systems in the EU governments to communicate and cooperate with one another. And the approach that the EU is taking to that is to have a kind of because the scope of this problem is very big, right? You have in rules as code the issue of how do you make sure that one coding works with another encoding in the same system. But in the EU, you additionally have the question of how do you make sure that an encoding of an act that implements a EU regulation in country A works the same or works interoperably with the encoding of an act in a different country that implements that same regulation. And then on top of that, you have all of these issues about languages, because the legislation is being re-implemented in different countries, and you have to make sure that it's not the words of one version of the act that's being implemented, but it's a kind of abstract semantic representation of what the act means. So they're very interested in taking kind of a step back or above from the text of laws to representing semantic concepts in an ontologies kind of a way, and then having the individual countries map the things that they're saying in their legislation to those semantic concepts in some way that allows them to be translated back and forth, despite differences in technology, despite differences in language. So there was a lot of talk about semantic level solutions to the interoperability problem. The second one is scaling, which basically just meant how can we get more people doing this? There are a few cases where it has been implemented in the EU and successfully, and they're just they're actively exploring how can we get more of the EU countries doing this? How can we spread this out among the public sector further? The third one was community growth, which is maybe an offshoot of scaling. They need more people to be aware of it and more people to collaborate with each other in terms of how they're doing it and share lessons. Exactly the same reason that this guild exists. And then the next topic was open source and open standards. And this was a little different than I anticipated when I first heard this. When they're talking about open source, basically what they're saying is, hey, all of you governments that have already implemented a rules as code solution in-house, please open source the technologies that you are using to do that so that other people can try too, right? This was not an exhortation on the government that whatever you build it in open source and let's all use the same thing. It was whatever you have, open source it so other people can try it too. That was the motivation behind the open source topic. Open standards had more to do with the EU issues of interoperability. The EU, in order to accomplish the Interoperable Europe Act, they anticipate that they're going to have to specify some sort of a standard. So that's kind of where that conversation was coming from. Next, institutional capacity and long-term support. I don't think to anyone's surprise, it is an ongoing issue how to get resources and political buy-in for rules as code undertakings. So that was a major issue. The next one is tax administration 3.0. This is a committee of the OECD, a number of members of whom were there, including from some non-European countries. In fact, a person from the Canada Revenue Agency who sits on this committee was at the conference. And that committee is looking at a kind of a rules as code-esque way of making tax laws more consistent with one another internationally. And this comes down to simple stuff like what constitutes a business, what constitutes income. Like, can we come up to some basic definitions for these things that would give us that semantic layer so that we can say what we're referring to in different countries is actually the same thing. And then also give that as a kind of a data structure on which encodings for the individual government's tax laws could be built so that all of those encodings would be consistent with one another. I was not able to get an impression about how ambitious this is or like where it is in the topic, but it came up a lot, and it was a major topic of conversation. Next was improving legal and technical communication. So in the rules as code process, you have to have the subject matter experts and you have to have the technologists, and it was a regular topic of conversation. How do we make that conversation lower friction than it is now? And then the potential for AI-assisted code generation was a kind of forward-looking topic. While everyone was interested in that, no one was talking about having actually done it. So it's kind of like people were very interested to see what could be done. People were saying the next conference is going to be very interesting because we'll find out what agents are able to do in terms of generating rules as code with some of these technologies. So those were the major themes. I mentioned there were 5 production systems that were discussed. 2 from the Netherlands, 1 from Sweden, and then 1 from France and 1 from the EU. The biggest one, I would say, might be the Dutch tax administration system. So this is a combination of ALEF, which is the Agile Law Execution Factory. This is, I think, the name that they've given to their development environment that their tax subject matter experts use to do their rules as code encodings. I will try to pronounce this correctly. Regelspraak is the Dutch version of rule speak, and I think that is the coding language that is used inside ALEF. The people who were talking about the recent changes to ALEF were saying that ALEF and Regelspraak may be open source as soon as April of this year. And so if that happens, that's a very big deal, because this is, I think, by far the biggest rules as code implementation in the real world that I've ever heard of. They said that 50% of all tax administration determinations are being made automatically by their rules as code implementation of their own tax laws. Fully half already, which is phenomenal. So that was the Dutch tax administration. Swedish tax administration has a similar system. I wasn't able to get as much detail about to what extent it's being used, but I was able to learn that unlike the ALEF and the Regelspraak system, it's based on some sort of flowchart-esque system, something along the lines of business process modeling notation. So the language in which the subject matter experts are encoding the legislation is a visual flowchart-esque language. That same or a very similar solution is also being used in the Dutch environmental area, where they have, there's a mandatory requirement at all levels of government that if you are making environmental regulations, you must publish them as something that they call applicable rules. And these applicable rules, I'm kind of putting pieces, I'm filling in gaps a little bit here, so I could be wrong, but I think the understanding is that whatever your jurisdiction is, you have a physical jurisdiction, like a map, an area of the country that you are responsible for. And this can be you know, the national government, it can be regional governments, it can be municipal governments, it can be regulatory authorities that have responsibility over specific water catchments. It can be, you know, a variety of different things with these kind of overlapping physical jurisdictions. And my understanding is that this Dutch environmental system is designed very much around the idea of, if you put a pin on a map, it can tell you what the environmental regulations are at that pin. And that's the motivation. And my understanding is that it's mandatory to publish environmental laws that way in the Netherlands so that they can be implemented in this system. It's complicated because it is dealing with this overlapping physical jurisdiction issue. And there's so many different rule makers. But my understanding is that if you are in the Netherlands and you need to figure out if you're allowed to build a berm next to a canal, there's one website that you can go to that will tell you all of the people that you need to talk to and what you need to satisfy with regard to that sort of a thing. So that was the other main rules as code implementation. The other two highlighted to remind me that those are the only two that are built in things that are currently open source. So the French benefits system, I think most of us may have heard of before. Mesaid, I think, might be the name of the website, which was built on top of the OpenFisca system. And then the EU also has a policy-based microsimulation project that is operated out of Greece, I believe, called Euromod. And what that does is it encodes tax laws that come out of all of the EU countries so that it can do, and then it also collects data like population data, and then does a microsimulation along the lines of the kinds of things that OpenFisca can do in order to detect what likely effect is this change going to have on the tax impacts on people in countries A, B, and C, if they're all changing their laws at the same time. So those are the 5 big things that are actually happening, production-wise in Europe in rules as code, at least that I learned about at the conference. A few things on the technology side. The Dutch tax authority is evidently working on a version of ELEF and Regelspraak that uses an answer set logic programming system. The details of that are complicated, and I did not have the time to kind of dig in. But after I gave my presentation, one of the developers of Regelspraak came up and told me that, yeah, we're looking at a very similar implementation version, but designed on a different language so that the logic programming code would be fast enough that we could use it as the source code of our tax system. That it would be performant enough that it would be directly what was calculating people's taxes. They recently added implicit temporal logic to Regelspraak, and the other technology thing is that I heard from the policy engine people that they were thinking of moving away from their forked version of OpenFisca to a new thing that we're calling RaC. I think there's other people in this meeting who could probably tell us more about that than me. So let's ask more about that later because I'm curious. But that was kind of all that I heard in terms of like what's changing in the technology that's being used for rules as code. So surprises. These are the things that I came away with that I wasn't anticipating. But Sweden and the Netherlands are maybe 10 years ahead of everyone else, as far as I can tell, in terms of actually using rules as code in tax and environmental legislation administration. That was, I knew that they were doing things. I had no idea how far they had gotten. It was dramatically better than I had anticipated. Second, all of the internally built rules as code systems were using non-code user interfaces, and subject matter experts were doing the encodings. I have been a big advocate that the subject matter experts should be the ones doing the encodings, which is part of the reason that I built Blawx the way that I built it. But I didn't realize that that idea is essentially unanimous across all of the non-microsimulation implementations in Europe. In all of the cases, the experts own the code, was the slogan. The third thing that surprised me is that the consultants were there. Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers both showed up. Deloitte was giving away a book that they called the Orange Book, which would not have been very useful to me because it was in Dutch. But they were talking about a product that they are selling in their public sector consulting. PricewaterhouseCoopers, I don't think they had a product, but they had a consulting area that was leaning towards rules as code work. So that was surprising to me. That's an involvement that I haven't seen before. The next surprise was that the rules as code community there seems to be about 10 times the size of the rules as code community in the English-speaking countries, in my perception. I was at the first plenary. I was sitting down with the lady I mentioned, Ms. Smith from the Canada Revenue Agency, and I was looking around at this enormous room of people and saying, if you tried to hold this conference in North America, I don't know that you would get 30 people. And there were 300 there. And I anticipate, like, I think it was limited to 300 based on the size of the facility. I don't think they could have gone bigger. So maybe it's even bigger than that. And yet, all of the people that I was talking to who are working in rules as code in these different governments in the EU, they also say almost no one in those governments knows anything about it. Right? So they're 10 times ahead of us, in perception at least, and still think of themselves as very, very niche. And so all of that was very surprising to me. I didn't see any of that coming. My big takeaways are that the OECD is doing things with tax, the EU is doing things with interoperability, and all of the governments are facing ongoing resource pressures that rules as code can potentially help with. And the systems that have been successful so far are maybe about to become open source. So that sounds to me like a recipe for a lot more people doing this in 5 years than are doing it now. I think there's a growing momentum inside Europe. The second thing is, if the Netherlands can actually see their way clear to open sourcing the tool that they're using, I think there's every reason to believe that's going to become the de facto standard for how rules as code is done in tax. The tooling is very sophisticated. It's very friendly. Hearing the people running those systems talk about it, the tax experts who are using those systems and doing those encodings are fully on board that is their job. That doing rules as code is how you run a tax agency. And so, given the success that the Netherlands has had and the proof point that their tax system serves, I think that you can expect a lot of people to be experimenting with that technology as soon as that is an option. The existing open source alternatives were all there. They were all being discussed, and particularly in the policy analysis side, they were being discussed, the microsimulation side. In terms of delivery of government services, I didn't really hear any momentum for any of the open source alternatives right now. So if Railsproc comes out as an alternative there, I think it may just take off. And then again, I was surprised to learn that the rule across the board for these successful implementations is that the encodings belong to the experts. The software teams build tools, they don't do encodings. It's the tax experts who do the encodings, and those encodings are what is actually running the system and cutting checks. Oh, and then also I did a presentation on Blawx, which was very well attended. The room was full. and I showed off version 2, which was live as of December. And then I showed off a couple of experiments that I've been doing, one having the AI do code generation inside Blawx, and one using the answers to a query in Blawx as a way to generate tests for automating code writing in another language that is generating a system that's trying to be compliant with the Blawx encoding. And I got some very positive feedback, including from people who are working on the Dutch tax system. I had named the session a user-friendly tool for rules as code, and the complaint that I got from some of the participants in the session was that you didn't advertise this correctly. We have lots of user-friendly ways of doing it. This is just another one. What we don't have is a system that can do reasoning the way that Blawx does reasoning. And so this should have been called a more sophisticated reasoning way of doing rules as code, or something along those lines. So, which is good feedback to have, because I didn't realize that that's where it sat. So, and then I met lots of people. I have a long list of probably 7 contacts that I need to get back in touch with to have further conversations. So it was very much worth going. And yeah, that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. That's my spiel.
That's an incredibly detailed roundup. Thank you very much indeed for the briefing. And how exciting is that it's taking off in such a way, and the open sourcing of the tools that are being used is being pursued, it sounds like, with some vigor.
Yeah, they were very kind of, they apologized as they were saying this, because they said, it seems like every time we meet people, we tell them that we are just about to open source it. And we've been telling people that for 3 years. And so they were like, we understand if you don't believe us, but we genuinely think it's going to happen in the first half of this year, and maybe as soon as by the end of April. So
yeah, the open sourcing process is not a straightforward process, right? There's a lot to it, and getting some experts in that process around those tools sounds like a good idea. So if you were advising a smaller jurisdiction, or anybody really in our community, without the resources that are obviously being thrown at the problem in the Netherlands, where would you start with those Dutch and Swedish examples? Like, where would you go to first? There's so much in what you've said. So
yeah, I mean, there's a lot about this that is still kind of opaque, because they're still closed source systems. So it's difficult to kind of see the internal details. As soon as it becomes possible to play with RaC, I think people who are working in Rules as code ought to consider that an obligation. As soon as that's available, we need to dig in and see what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. It's not perfect. Then they've talked about some of the challenges that come from modeling things that way. Every formalism you have to fit the rules to the formalism to a certain extent. And so there are always these kinds of edge cases that become more complicated than you expect. But having had a little bit of experience working in the node and wire visual interface before, and kind of seeing the way that the people from the Netherlands were talking about how RaC is built, if all of these things became available at the same time, RaC is still the one that I would want to try first.
Right.
I think that's got. I think it's got, just from my understanding of the underlying infrastructure of how it's built and the quality of the tooling, just how the tools looked in the presentations. it really seems like a thing that would be friendly for a subject matter expert to be able to work with. And like really, they've just done a ton of really good work to build up the tooling. Because the people who were in charge of building the tooling were not also in charge of implementing anything. And so they were able to just focus on this one thing and serve as a kind of infrastructure for the tax authority. So yeah, that's what I would say. As soon as that becomes available, you need to take a look at that and play with that and figure out how it works, and start to give it to some subject matter experts and understand better what the workflow is of having the subject matter experts get involved and build codings and test codings and learn about, you know, all of the nitty-gritty details about once it works, how does it turn into software that actually gets deployed somewhere to, you know, cut a check or run a website or what have you. There's a lot there. The second thing that I would say is whatever is happening in Rules as Code Europe going forward, we need to be far better connected to, because they have a degree of momentum there that we don't have, and being able to keep pace with it is going to depend on interpersonal relationships with people who have already done it in the Netherlands primarily, and also Sweden. I think being able to keep pace and catch up and push the agenda is going to depend on getting the help of those people. They are extremely motivated to help. They've wanted to open source it for a long time. They know the potential here. They're getting pressure from the EU to do it. They're getting pressure from the OECD to do it. Everyone is on the same page about what has to happen. And so I think once it finally does kind of crack open, there's going to be a lot of demands on their time. And so I would aim for building up relationships with people who are doing this stuff inside the Netherlands government specifically, so that when the opportunity comes, you have those contacts that you can use to keep pace.
Cool. Mike, I don't know whether you want to ask your question directly, but I'd love to broaden it out as well. We've heard about tax and we've heard about environmental law. Mike's asking about healthcare. Go for it, Mike.
Yeah, I'm probably is it like there's interesting stuff happening in Europe right now around healthcare and open data and data sovereignty, and I'm watching a whole bunch of stuff. I wasn't aware of the Rules as Code work outside of France, and really exciting to hear that. But specifically with healthcare, I'd be interested in knowing if there's anything that's that you heard about when you were there. Is there any involvement with the Rules as Code in the healthcare sector?
So not specifically. There were conversations about it on the EU interoperability level. They were talking about like the ability to transfer patient records back and forth between countries when people migrate. But in terms of like cases where it's been deployed, I didn't see any of that. But then again, there were, I think, around 30 presentations, and I was able to go to 6 or 7. So it's possible that there was stuff going on there that I didn't see.
Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Did you manage to see the Germans at all? Was what I
in a sense.
What I'm interested in is, like you just said about the floodgates opening, April is what the Germans have been saying is when they're going to open source all their big stuff. And I wonder whether something's going on there. And it was interesting yesterday that they were at the Open Fisker jamboree in Australia.
Yeah.
So things, and the Germans, like you, I've heard the Dutch say, oh, it'll be open source in a while, but for now, we're not telling you anything whatsoever. And it's been very frosty. Whereas the Germans straight from as soon as they've got in touch with anybody, have been saying we're going to be open sourcing this soon.
Yeah, there was a strong German presence there. I don't believe, you know, to be frank, I spoke with maybe 5 or 6 people who were attending from Germany. I know that at least one of them was coming from a consultancy in Germany. I forget which one. I believe the rest of them that I spoke to were just there in a kind of an exploratory sense. They weren't people who had deployed it. They were people who wanted to learn more. But there was also some conversations about some of the tools that are in use in Germany. You know, it occurs to me that if the 3rd Rules as Code Europe conference is held in Frankfurt or something, then I might have learned a lot more there, right? But the Germans were present, but not loud.
All right, the system they're using is called rule mapping, which is by a consultancy.
Oh, yes. And
yeah,
the rule mapping people did do a presentation at the
Right.
conference, and that was one of the very many things I wanted to see and couldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
They say that they have got it in production in German government departments, and that now they're going to open source it, and they're going to keep their AI bit proprietary. And then the German government are saying that they'll go through OECD to get international agreement on a standard for rules as code, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of gently shared my skepticism about standardizing rules as code while I was there, because you've probably heard me say before, I don't think the tools are sufficiently mature that we should be standardizing on anything that we have now. But I think that what the kind of higher level thing that the EU is looking at, where they don't really care whether or not everyone is implementing it with the same technology, but they would like there to be some consistency in terms of data inputs and terminology that's being used across the systems. I think that's extremely reasonable, and that doesn't stop anyone from innovating in any way that they want to. So I think that kind of interoperability is a very good idea. But, you know, it's hypocritical of me to say this as a person who since December is selling his own rules as code tool. But people who are selling their own rules as code tool ought not to be our experts on standardization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Nicholas, you've got a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Oh.
Little echo.
How's that? I think that's
Much better.
Much better.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I had 2 kinds of questions. Thank you for your presentation and for kind of being a representative of the US in this space. Or, well, actually, you're from Canada, aren't you?
I am from Canada, but
Yeah.
I think of myself as representing the Anglophone.
Yes.
Code team.
Appreciate that. One is more specifically technical. I was wondering if anyone brought up dynamic condition response. I know that the Danish government, I think, is using that. It's kind of like a variant or flavor of BPMN that is interesting to me as someone who's been doing some work with DMN. So I was curious if anything like that came up. And the second question is on the kind of implementation layer of these systems, especially for some of these production systems you mentioned, where these institutions actually are processing people's real world outcomes. Did they get into any of the details of the way those integrations work, how they're defining cases that do apply to those systems versus don't, how they're inputting, you know, their data in whatever institutional formats they have it, that kind of thing?
The short answers to both of those questions is no. There were conversations about the varieties of tools that are being used. There was one consultant that I spoke to who I believe was from a Dutch consulting firm they had a variant on business process modeling that they were using, but we didn't have time to get into the details. So there were conversations about, versions of the technologies that are out there, but the conversations could never get very deep. Everyone was very busy. And then on the second question, if you're interested in that sort of thing, and believe me, I am, there were things that you could glean from the presentations, right? You could watch and you could say, oh, I noticed that as this guy is running this demonstration, the way that he's doing is he's firing up a Docker container, and here's where, so you can kind of grab some stuff. But no, in terms of all of those kind of nitty-gritty details of, where does the data come from, and how do you triage people out of the automated system into something else, it didn't really come up. Not in the small portion of the sessions that I was able to attend.
Makes sense. Well, thank you anyway. That is interesting.
Philippa.
Mine was actually a comment rather than a question. Beyond saying thank you very much, that was fascinating. I did love to hear the roundup. I've taken notes, I've taken screenshots, and now have a lot more research to add to my to-do list. So thank you for that. But my more comment, I guess, was just going to be that we did have the rule mapping crowd present at the town hall. I can't remember if it was the last one or the one before, and that's going to be. Yeah, that's going to be going live soon, Jason. So we'll ping you when that's live. And then, although you missed them in The Hague, you can at least have a little catch up on that recording. So I'll let you know when that's live.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. I was looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our visitors here?
What were you
Hey, Jason.
mentioning? Sorry.
Oh,
sorry.
go ahead.
No, you go.
No,
You go, Max, because I think I was about to ask about policy engine, so off you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was curious if Regelschafft, is it just tax? Like, are they thinking of benefit policy, which is often paired, like OpenFisc is, and also are they thinking about microsimulation?
They're definitely not thinking about microsimulation. I don't know the extent to which they will be able to handle other kinds of policy or other kinds of benefit calculations. I anticipate anything that's capable of calculating tax is capable of calculating benefits, but I don't know the details. It is a very, it's, when I talked with them and when I listened to their presentations, the vibe that I got from them was the same vibe that I get from talking to people who work on Catala, which is they're very focused on like a system that's dealing with numbers in a particular way and dealing with currencies in a particular way. So they are very much focused on what you need in order to build a production tax system. But I don't know that that excludes it from being used anywhere else. It just wasn't really anything that they were demonstrating. But it definitely does not do microsimulation. There's no way to collect the data that you would need in order to be able to do that.
That's surprising. I mean, if it's used internally and they're trying to get it to run over all the tax records, I would think it would be possible even if they can't like make it publicly available. But
well, I don't think that it's a thing that they are using Regelspraak for, but also the Greece project Euromod is already covering some of those bases.
Sure. So a lot of countries do their own microsim on top of Euromod as well.
Yes.
Like Germany has GetSim, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know the details about how the Netherlands does microsim or where they use it or how, but yeah, it didn't feel like Regelspraak was built for that.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any more from the crowd? I've got another question for you, Jason, but I just before I jump in, Philippa, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if now's a forum, so or if it's possible just for a very quick summary, but you mentioned some changes with Policy Engine. Given we've got some people from Policy Engine on the line, I thought it might be interesting just to get a quick summary of what those changes are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Max. I had a quick conversation with Pavel there, and then he took me out for dinner, and we did not talk business at all. It was great, but there was a conversation with him about something that you guys are exploring. Maybe things have changed. He said you were talking to people basically at the same time that we were talking. So why don't you let us know what's happening?
Yeah, sure. So we, as some of you know, Policy Engine is a tax benefit microsimulation model in the US and the UK. And our core engine is derived from OpenFisca. So we have been experimenting, it's pretty early, but we're experimenting with the idea of having a new rules as code standard that rather than, I guess this might offend your sensibilities, Jason, but rather than having legal experts or policy experts do the encodings, like this is what our team of 10 have been doing the past 5 years that we've been around. You'll say, okay, you want to encode the Medicaid rules in the US. So you'll have some expert go into all the relevant regulations and the statutes and come up with an encoding. Instead of doing it that way, having a sort of statute or rule first approach, where you take the entire set of statutes and regulations, all the other policy documents, and break them up into atomic units that AI models can then encode entirely autonomously. So really investing in the upfront harness so that this can be fully automatic. And then doing that at scale. So we've had some promising early prototypes, some promising conversations with funder in the US. And you can check it out if you'd like. It's Axiom Foundation, axiom-foundation.org. And as part of that, we did develop this new format called RaC in honor of our whole community, which basically, yeah, the idea is it's a domain-specific language that then compiles to Python, Rust, kind of JavaScript, whatever you want. And it's derived really strictly from the source document. So we'd love to share more updates as we make more progress on it. I think we'll have more to share probably in the next month or two. But yeah, happy to also answer specific questions now, if that's helpful.
It sounds like we should have you back for another Rules as Code guild to demonstrate some of that stuff as well, Max.
Happy to, yeah.
Absolutely. And I will just share one other thing just to show that you're not offending my sensibilities at all, Max. This is a blog post that I put up, I think, 2 days ago, and it's on the current progress in getting agentic AI code generation working inside Blawx. And basically what the blog post goes through is that I have this example project that's up on the system that's just excerpts of 3 related statutes and regulations. And then I gave the system a short prompt, and then it went through autonomously a long process. It created a number of categories. It created a long list of relationships. It created a bunch of fact scenarios. It created a bunch of questions, and then it generated encodings for all of the individual sections of the legislation in the Blawx user interface, tested those encodings, corrected them when it was incorrect, and generated something that genuinely seems to work relatively well. So it's early days, but I think that my sensibility is not that the experts need to be the ones drafting the code. My sensibility is that the experts need to be the ones who own it and are validating it and determining what code actually gets used. So yeah, I think there's a huge degree of potential there because the time involved in formalizing the laws is absolutely enormous, and it's a major obstacle. So many of the design choices that went into the current version of Blawx were designed specifically to facilitate getting more help from AI in the drafting.
Philippa.
I'm going to drop in a link in the chat, just the collective unconscious at work. We're doing something very similar in terms of trying to, use AI to support the process and get rid of some of those barriers of how long it takes to get from, from the rules to the code. So I've just dropped a link in there as well.
Perfect.
So it's all happening around the world. Yay.
It is, yeah, and it will be very interesting to see like the combination of an open source tool that has been actually deployed by a national government in Europe and is actually calculating taxes for people, and the current generation of AI coding assistants. We live at a very interesting time, because things that would have been completely unrealistic 2 years ago, even if RaC was available, are now suddenly feasible with the AI technologies that we have, if these languages come out. Yeah, I think there are, I think everyone kind of sees the opportunity and the promise of combining these things, and when we finally get there, things are going to move fast, I think.
Yeah, it was one of the things that Con actually talked about at the conference yesterday, was that, rules as code has been trying to take off, and all the benefits have been so obvious for years. But the thing that's changed in the last, couple of years, and it's happening so quickly that even the last 3 months, there's been developments that have made, doing some of this process with AI support so much more possible. So yeah, I think it's exciting what the future holds in the rules as code space. And yeah, particularly hearing what you've said about what's happening overseas, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's the other thing that's interesting about it is that in addition to making it easier to write code in the tools that we have, it also opens up a whole other level of the horizon of possibilities in terms of new tools that we could generate has grown enormously. Because when I started like 7 years ago tooling around with open source libraries to try and build the first version of Blawx, like there was stuff that I could accomplish in a given set of time. But in the amount of time that I have spent working on Blawx over the course of the last 7 years, if I spent that amount of time again starting now, I would be exponentially further ahead than I am now, right? So I don't, it's very difficult to kind of even be comfortable that the solution, that what we ought to be doing is automating the tools that we have. I'm still very much of the opinion that like the opportunity to build completely new things that no one has thought of before is more realistic now than it has ever been. And so that's part of why I was encouraging people at the conference: resist standardization and promote experimentation. That was my tagline for my presentation.
I love that. That's awesome, and a great place to wrap this up, guys, because we've been here an hour. It's so exciting. It's crazy. I love your tagline from the conference. Definitely experimentation. It opens some new questions with that level of experimentation. What about the governance of all of this in the code? I'm fascinated to find out a little bit more from you about the governance of putting everything in the hands of the experts, and what happens with the auditing and all of the follow-up. But that's another large discussion to open another time. So maybe we can continue this discussion in the Slack channel for everybody watching. There is a rules as code racguild.org Slack channel, which you can join by going through the website. There is also videos of all of our previous rules as code town halls, including the rule mapping technology from Germany, which has been sponsored by the German government. So there's a deep dive of that. It's about to go up, Philippa mentioned earlier. And yeah, we've obviously got a couple of things that we need to line up for future RaC guilds. So Jason, we need to see the new version of Blawx. We need to see.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
The policy engines work and the Axiom Foundation. So there's a number of things that we need to line up coming up. And also a little bit of a report from the Open Fisca conference that happened in Canberra just this week. So yeah, exciting times. Maybe we should meet a little bit more often, and also maybe start thinking about, and if anybody has any ideas about how the RaC Guild and all of this activity that's happening in Europe can maybe come a little bit closer, or exchange a little bit more in the manner of the presentation you've given us this morning, Jason. So yeah, lots of follow-up to do. Con, you've got 10 seconds.
Just quickly, just to remind everyone, there is also a resources section on the RaC Guild website. So through the contact form, you can actually submit suggestions for resources to post there. Probably haven't updated it more recently, but it is a way of, again, trying to promote and publish, useful, interesting information to the community.
So please do contribute everything that you would like to that, because all of it helps us move this along even faster. Our next meeting will be on the first Monday of May. I cannot believe that we're talking about May. I can't believe we're in April. It will be the 6th of May. That's the first Wednesday. And it's at the opposite time zone. So us guys down here in the Antipodes are going to be staying up until late. For everybody else, I think it's a bit easier for Europe. So invite your friends along. Yeah, we're a growing community. It's growing fast, as you can hear. And look forward. Thank you again to Jason for the presentation. And we look forward to seeing you again next month. Take care.